Yeah, I'm Marlo. I'm from Carbon Coat. Thanks for that intro, Sandy. I'm just going to be going through the first bit, the presentation bit. It is quite dense information, so feel free to just stick questions in the chat or make a note. And if you put slide numbers with it, I can kind of go back to that when we're answering questions at the end. But I'll just start now, I think. Yeah, so a bit of a background to this session. Carbon Co-op and PPR started seeing an increased interest in heat pumps amongst members and service users, but we're kind of missing the skills and knowledge base to really fulfill this. So we underwent research the past couple of years into just asking lots of questions for heat pump users, installers, suppliers, etc., to identify the kind of current gaps in the installation process in terms of support and services, and what can be done to plug this. So this presentation is kind of learning from this research. I'm not going to be covering much technical stuff, but the aims of the session basically for you to be able to communicate and advise membership on specifying heat pumps, so like a starter point for that, and considering how your organisation could include heat pumps in existing services. So we'll look at advising heat pumps householders on heat pumps first of all. So yeah, the research that we did talking to different members that have got heat pumps installed, there's basically 3 different householder types that we talked with. So we've got enthusiastic. These householders are highly motivated, really engaged and able to research independently. And there's a lot more opportunities for things like monitoring and optimization later down the line. I can discuss that further later. There's kind of interested householders that want some interaction with the process. They want to have the best heat pump and heat pump options, but their ability to be engaged in like research independently doesn't go as far as the enthusiastics, basically. And then there's the pragmatic householders that want minimal interaction with the process. They basically just want a plug and play system, and they want to outsource as much decision making as possible for just a smooth process and yes and no answers and things like that. So all our householders will go through the same journey. So the first decision, I guess, specifically is a heat pump the appropriate choice at this stage for them? And the answer to that is either no, so using that budget for other improvements around the home to help become more heat pump ready, and can go around to this, or it's yes, and then we're moving on to looking at research and advice around specific types of heat pump and options. They then undergo a heat pump survey, which allows for the design and installation, and then post installation you've got optimization and monitoring and servicing and maintenance. So I've just put asterisks on the stages that we think that community energy groups can support most effectively and where there's the biggest gaps in the current process. There. So I'm going to go through each of these stages now and just talk a bit about the kind of steps in the process, the advice that we would give to householders, and just some possible roles that we could see community energy groups playing in the future, which is a non-exhaustive list, just things that we thought about. So looking at the first stage, so you might have seen Carbon Co-op's presentation with Nesta on how much insulation is needed in a house for heat pumps, and this is basically just a quick version of that presentation that I'm going to go over now. So first of all, is a useful tool in communicating priorities when reducing home energy consumption is the energy hierarchy. So obviously prioritizing reducing the space heating demand by improving insulation and air tightness works, and then using energy more efficiently through heating, lighting and ventilation, and then supplying this reduced energy demand through renewables. So heat pumps fit into step 2, so after fabric priorities, basically. What does this mean specifically for heat pumps? So I think the best way of talking about is kind of comparing harder to heat houses, and this might be poly insulated houses or leaky houses or large houses, because that the larger houses are more difficult to heat effectively with heat pumps. and kind of the pros and cons for a harder house replacing with a heat pump. So immediately you get a reduction in carbon emissions due to electrification of heating. And it might also be beneficial if they're looking at upgrading a very old or inefficient boiler or a broken boiler, instead of replacing with like a new boiler that'll be there for like 10 to 15 years. Considering a heat pump at this stage might be the better option. However, with a harder to heat house, you obviously need a bigger unit to provide that space heating demand. That comes with higher upfront costs and higher running costs. You need larger emitters, that's radiators, in order to provide the heat required. So you're much more likely to have to replace the radiators in the house, which obviously has costs entailed. You'll also have householders asking about whether they can just put in a heat pump now and look at insulation works later, but that comes with a risk of oversizing a heat pump later down the line. So that can come with cycling, and where a heat pump turns itself off because it can achieve the heating required kind of too easily, so it turns itself on and off, and that's running really inefficiently. There is also just an increased risk linked with having a harder to heat house. I guess if you take out the existing boiler and replace it with a heat pump, that can be really hard to undo. And if anything has gone wrong in terms of calculations or surveys or anything, and the heat pump is undersized, for example, then you have a heating system that isn't providing enough heat in a cold house, and that can up the risk to householders living in a cold house, basically. Compare that to an easier to heat house, so smaller, better insulated, more airtight. You've got a reduced heating demand, which means a smaller unit, reduced costs up front and running. You've addressed the comfort issues in the house by prioritising fabric works. You can have smaller emitters, so you're less likely to have to replace the radiators in the house. You can integrate this into a retrofit plan if you're undertaking a retrofit plan, a whole house retrofit, that is. With a reduced heating demand, there's more capacity for your heat pump to provide hot water. However, the fabric work may take up all of your budget, and then you'd have to build that up again in order to get a heat pump. So it's ultimately down to householder priorities and decisions, but being able to communicate the risks of these things, I think, is really important, especially with the conversations around heat pumps at the moment. So I guess there's this immediate question from householders of, is my house insulated enough? Is it easy enough to heat at the moment? And that can be quite a difficult question to answer, because it's quite complex. It depends on lots of different factors in the house and priorities and such. But we've been able to see a few different ways of being able to answer these questions. So for maybe less engaged householders, they quite want they want just a yes or no, basically. And there are some quick estimator tools, such as from the Gov.uk website or Dakin, as well as others. However, they're very limited and they make large assumptions. There's very little information you input to those, and it doesn't tell you about any house issues that you might have. So there are concerns with those. There could be full home surveys, so just doing a more detailed home survey. That could be the specific heat pump survey, or it could be retrofit assessments like PPR's home retrofit planner, because the information you need out of that is space heating demand, peak loads, and a survey of the major comfort or building health issues. So these surveys would come with a higher cost attached, obviously, but it would give you a more detailed yes or no appropriate answer. We've also thought about case studies, so we don't have any of these at the moment, but it was an idea. So talking to homes that live comfortably with their heat pump currently, and asking them kind of the size of the home, insulation and airtight measures that they put in before getting a heat pump, the cost of the heat pump, so that householders can kind of compare themselves to others that are living with a heat pump currently, and also be able to picture like potential retrofit measures that they could go with before doing a heat pump, and kind of gauge it that way. For more engaged households, there's the option of lowering the boiler flow temperature as a trial throughout winter, so down from maybe 60 to 80 of what a boiler is to 35 to 45, which would be heat pump temperatures. So that's kind of emulating how a heat pump would run and seeing if you're comfortable living with that. There is Nesta guidance for combi gas boilers online. It's quite a straightforward process, but they do need to extend the heating period to kind of give those conditions. And you need to consider health and safety risks before advising this. If they're vulnerable to cold, for example, it's obviously an experiment, and they need to be able to put the heating back up if they are too cold in the house. It's a very low cost way of trialing, and it's quite a good one, but yeah, it's quite involved and obviously a longer period. Yeah, so possible roles that we see for community energy groups at this stage is offering advice. So there's lots of, like I said, it depends. So being able to have one-to-one conversations and offering partial advice. There's making these case studies, so engaging with residents in your local area that have heat pumps already and building these case studies and sharing them. And there is some scope for offering survey or assessment services. Just a note, installers will have to conduct their own heat pump survey for liability issues in terms of the actual design process. But indicative surveys or home retrofit assessments is something that could be offered. Yeah, so we'll move on to the next steps. So say they've gone through that, and yes, they think they're ready for a heat pump, and moving on to research and advice. The steps in this kind of making decisions around funding and budget, heat pump options and preference, and really importantly, life after install. So making decisions upfront about what's going to happen at the end makes things a lot easier. And contacting installers, having those initial conversations and questions. In terms of funding options advice, speaking to our householders, the average cost has been about 8 to 17 grand on heat pumps. There is the boiler upgrade scheme running until 2025, which offers 5 grand off the air source and 6 off the ground source. You do need an MCS certified installer, and it is installer led, so they apply on behalf of the resident. So you need to ensure that process goes smoothly, basically. There's a long list of eligibility stuff for this. You can look on the Gov website, but I just thought I'd mention these key points. The heat pump needs to replace all fossil fuel systems in the house for heating and hot water, so you can't have a backup boiler with it and access the boiler upgrade scheme. You can have electrical sources of heat, so like a plug-in radiator or a wood burning stove, for example, as a backup. Yeah, there can be no cavity wall or loft insulation recommendations outstanding on EPCs, which is what the government require. This is obviously a little bit, it could be under retrofitted, under fabric worked. There's very low requirements basically in terms of insulation, but that's what they've made eligible. And there are some technical requirements, such as like the coefficient of performance, so it being a certain amount of efficiency. Other options is Octopus and Halifax mortgages, so they offer 1 grand with qualifying mortgages. I think £500 towards fabric works, and possible local authority funding for heat pumps or fabric works. You have to look in your area. In terms of options for the heat pump, basic considerations that all householders should be making, thinking about where the unit could go inside and in the garden, the different parts of the unit. Who can you go to if something goes wrong? This is a kind of earlier technology that's being picked up wider, and there have been problems. So having a trusted source of information and advice early on in case something goes wrong. Living with a heat pump and how that's different to a boiler. And other considerations, maybe for more engaged householders to think about more in depth, is different possible components. For example, domestic hot water options can be quite varied, and what fits for them. So considering an undersized unit, so units are based, the heat pump size is based on the peak load, which should be the coldest day of the year. So there is potential to undersize it a little bit so that it's running more efficiently for the rest of the year, and having just a backup system for those really cold days, instead of just doing a bigger size to meet the coldest day demands. Other householders' experiences and lessons learned, performance and monitoring options, who will access this info. I'd say this should be a consideration for everyone, but to different levels of thought about it, I guess. And fitting into a retrofit timeline optimally in terms of access to different parts of the house and design and things if you're doing a whole house retrofit. Here I've just got some basic sources of information to start sending householders to around these things. For talking to installers, so research and installer tips. Accredited doesn't guarantee quality. The MCS accreditation is needed for the boiler upgrade scheme, but it doesn't mean that they're necessarily the best installers. So contacting manufacturers and asking who they send in to fix problems can be quite a good way of finding installers that they trust and are doing a good job. And then just general that you'd do for any installer, track records, heat pumps a focus for them, etc. And then questions for installers, so things around experience, both with installing heat pumps and applying for the boiler upgrade scheme on behalf of householders. The process in the information that they share at each step. So what's their specific process and how do they communicate things at each step? Do they offer consultations? Do they offer visits, or is it just you're left with a big manual? And getting things written at this point so you can hold them to it at later points if they're failing to communicate that the way they promised can be quite important. What services do they offer post installation? So maintenance and monitoring options, and who you're talking to. We've had householders that have really been sold by just sales reps that can't communicate the information that they need to know, but really selling them on things and getting themselves into quite difficult situations with undersized or oversized heat pumps, for example. So just that general awareness. Yeah, so possible roles we see, funding advice, especially local funding, kind of expanding the case studies to cover all these kinds of things. And in terms of installer advice, you can get lists of local installers with recent reviews to reflect their current performance, and potentially question packs for initial conversations, just to have a bit of a script to follow for householders so they feel more confident having those conversations. Yeah, so we're going to move on to the survey section. So the steps in this is booking a survey. It does come with a cost. It should be a separate cost to the rest of the installer services. It's just this bit up front. The assessor comes to the home for the survey, takes some measurements and looks at the condition of the house and speaks to the householder. They then go away and calculate the heat loss for each room, which gives the unit size and the radiator sizes required. And then the resident should be provided with the survey results. So in terms of advice, the survey should be detailed and take time. It should take a couple of hours, and they should be looking to gather all the information that they need and having those proper conversations. If it's just a 15-minute walkthrough, it can be a bit of a red flag. Householders are entitled to the results of the survey. It's a service that they're paying for. And it's kind of test of whether the installer is sticking to the promises that they made up front in the kind of salesy bit. And it is sensible to keep a written record of all the information that goes on in case there are problems down the line. So the role that we can see with community energy groups would be offering a calculation or survey check. And we've offered this for a few householders before, also just looking over the surveyor's measurements and calculations and stuff and make sure that they're sizing everything correctly. And also an explanation of the results of the survey if that's something important to the householder but that isn't offered by installers, just telling them what different bits mean and why they've been recommended certain units, for example. So the next couple of stages, there's a bit less involvement. from community energy groups, because it'll be the installer leading on these pretty much. So with design, you have that final decision to go with the installer, pay a deposit, the designer made, and then you have a chance to confirm those designs before it goes ahead. So it's really important to give all the input that you want to give on designs before you've paid the deposit, basically. If you have certain preferences for things, or if you want to undersize the unit, you need to have those conversations before the designs go ahead, because that's a paid service, and you'll have to pay for it again if you want to make huge changes. In terms of installation, you book the installation period, they come and replace the system, and then you have a handover with the householders to different extents for different installers, I guess. For advice, we've got preparation for the installation. So they'll need to, it's just good to make the area of the home accessible to installers and to plan for the disruption. So you might be a couple of days without heating or hot water, and just have a plan for that. In terms of handover, so again, holding them to earlier promises. So if they're not offering the information or communications that they said they would earlier, just pressing them on that, because it's important for householders to know what they should be operating and how to be operating it. And then there are settling in visits offered by some installers, which we see as a really good thing. So a few months down the line, they'll come back and see how it's going, how they're living with it, and offer advice on that point, so that it really sets up a good ongoing relationship with the new heat pump system. Yeah, post installation, we've got optimization and monitoring. So tips for living with a heat pump. It does require different interaction to boilers because it's at a lower temperature, so you've got it running on for a longer time, and it's much slower at responding to temperature changes. So it's not like a boiler where you can just stick the room thermostat up and it'll immediately start heating up really quickly. It will take at least a few hours. So the householders that we've talked to that have a basic awareness of how heat pumps work and they're different to boilers are able to interact with them much better and optimize the kind of efficiency of them much better, because they know what to expect. So for controls for comfort, we recommend most householders stick with the room thermostats and potentially some different mode changes rather than the main controls. Enthusiasts may be able to engage more with that. I'll mention that in a bit. But yeah, the big one is not turning off the heat pump. It requires a lot of energy to turn it back on. It's really inefficient way of running it is to turn off the heat pump when you get too warm, for example. There are different modes, just holiday mode if you're away for a few weeks and you don't need the heating. So just households being aware of that's important. Monitoring, control and optimization. So for monitoring, it's really important to decide pre-installation what monitoring equipment is going to be installed, who has access to this data and what this looks like. So a lot of householders should be able to access data through the manufacturer's website if they've agreed to this with the installer before. So yeah, it's a lot cheaper and easier to install the monitoring equipment with the heat pump, especially things like flow meters that give the coefficient of performance, rather than to retrofit it later down the line. And if householders change their mind on how they want to control and optimize and stuff, then they'll have to go back and change the monitoring equipment. So it is really important to think about up front. In terms of control, it does go beyond comfort. Due to grid stresses, it's important to have a heat pump that responds to these stresses. Householders can make a lot of money savings on running it through payback schemes like we've seen this winter, basically reducing energy use at peak times. So this can be seen through smart grid ready heat pumps or manufacturer schedule blocking, which is like inputting times that reduce the energy consumption. The exact mechanisms will depend on the manufacturer installer, but being clear on these up front as well. And just a note on, on optimizing in general, provided the heat pump has been installed correctly, the installer configuration should be sufficient for most users, and just using the room thermostat. And if the understanding around heat pumps is lower, then that is what we recommend. However, enthusiasts are able to optimize settings to improve performance and significantly make savings on that. However, it is quite involved, and it's not a mass market thing at the moment, which moves us on to the possible roles for community energy groups. General advice, monitoring options, and understanding how that affects things late down the line and optimization. And again, what questions to ask installers about monitoring at this point. And post-installation optimization services. So like I said, it's not a simple information that you can give out in like a handout for people to be able to tweak the settings on their heat pump to optimize it. But it's potentially something that you can develop the skills for in-house and offer as a service to like help larger groups of householders access this improved performance. And just the last stage, servicing and maintenance. So there's general upkeep of cleaning and checking quite regularly. And then there's deep servicing. So that's recommended every 2 to 3 years for air source heat pumps, but some warranties do require annual. It's a good tip to service before winter, before you need the heat pump to be working daily. Make sure it's working in summer first. The standard fees for this are £150 to £300 with extras for repairs, so really budgeting that in to the ongoing cost of a heat pump is important to be aware of upfront. And planning who will do the servicing. Ideally, that would be the installers that put the heat pumps in. However, if they don't offer that as a service, who's going to be doing that for you? Having that planned, because it can be easy to forget, and it can make the heat pump run much less efficiently if you're not doing regular servicing. And that's my big bullet points. Hold on. Yeah, useful links. So you should get these with the slides, but it's just some of the things I've been talking about. And questions. It's going to take some questions.
Marlo, we had a question from Ivana from slide 20, which was on the boiler upgrade scheme. Would internal insulation instead of cavity wall insulation be accepted?
So in terms of the boiler upgrade scheme, if you have solid walls, I guess it's for any walls. I'm not actually sure. I think it probably would do. In terms of solid wall houses, obviously cavity wall isn't an option. If cavity wall isn't an option for that house, then there won't be a recommendation on it, so you don't need it for the boiler upgrade scheme. But if you do have a cavity and you've gone with internal instead, I'm assuming there'd be an argument for that, but I wouldn't know for that specific situation.
I think, sorry, just to add something to that, I think that would probably be something where the installer that's helping you apply for the boiler upgrade scheme might be able to advise. But I think just from the people powered retrofit side, I think thinking about whether to go with cavity wall or internal wall insulation, there's like condensation and moisture things to think about as well. So it might be the kind of thing where you have to just talk to the EPC assessor and say like, okay, we're doing internal wall insulation because this cavity has certain things, and then you might be able to talk to them and they wouldn't have that recommendation instead. So it's probably the EPC assessor you might want to talk to, as well as the installer for the heat pump when filling out the boiler upgrade scheme application.
I can see James has got his hand raised. Just before we go to James, Omar had a question, which was, when you use the word assessor, do you mean the general retrofit assessor role, or is there a specialist HP heat pump assessor role?
So you will have to get, it will be a heat pump assessor role, and as part of the installation service, that will be provided from the installer, because of the way that legal liability works. They generally have their own assessor. The installers will have their own assessor that will go do the heat pump assessments in order to do the designs based off that. Answer.
Great. And James, do you want to jump in?
I think I can change it so that James can unmute himself. 1 second. There we go. You can unmute yourself now to ask your question.
It was just a bit of feedback on the cavity wall situation. My understanding is that if a property is built, I think since the 90s onwards, then an EPC isn't likely to recommend cavity wall insulation. It's only because I think that's when they started using thermalite blocks, I believe. So it's only more older properties where you're likely to get a recommendation for cavity wall. One question from me. Heat pumps are also capable of cooling, and given the recent sort of climate issues we've been having, is that something that you think we should be highlighting to individuals?
Yeah, I think so. Heat pumps are not my area of expertise, to be honest. But yeah, I mean, again, I guess it fits into the fabric stuff of still prioritizing fabric works in order to help cooling through insulation. But yeah, it does fit into that, and it will become more relevant moving forwards. Yeah, so it applies both ways, especially if people are considering like air conditioning units, which I think they're getting more popular in the UK, so arguing for heat pumps instead of, yeah.
Just before we come to Laurie, who's got his hand raised, Tom had a question in the chat. Are there any comments on social housing or for people on prepay meters?
It's not my area of expertise. I think we've only been talking to householders that are owner occupied and paid for heat pumps. I don't know if Sandy's got any points.
I can just say, yeah, I was just going to say what you said. So our research was focused on specifically the kind of able to pay kind of early adopter type market. But when we do that, we're going to do a kind of workshop in the second half where we'll be looking at the needs of your particular membership or like the communities that you serve. So I'm hoping that we can kind of maybe answer that together as a group and look at that together, because it's a little bit obviously different, the needs and things like that.
Great, thanks, Sandy. And Laurie?
Yeah, I work with a local community group, and we're kind of, at the moment, I'm doing surveys of typical houses and kind of say what can be done in general in our area. So some of the heat pumps out now are kind of quoting COPs of well over 4 and also able to operate at flow temperatures of 60 degrees or more, which means that if they're delivering a COP of 3 and a bit with 60 degrees flow, then that actually does make them viable for an uninsulated house. And I'm just wondering but I'm not sure how true those COP numbers are in terms of what people really get from them. And I'm wondering if you've got any experience of actual COPs versus the quoted ones, and also whether people are proving able to adjust the flow temperature depending on the weather, for instance.
Yeah, I mean, that is a really interesting point. I think we haven't done specific research into that. Sorry, I've just gone a bit blank on a point that I was going to bring up. In terms of still recommending fabric works, I think it's that question of like, from my point of view, I'd always recommend fabric works still, even if the performance is really good, because then you can still get a smaller unit. It's a more efficient unit. You're going to have less strain on the unit potentially. So those kind of considerations I think are still valuable when recommending on fabric works first. I haven't done much research on the better performing ones now. I'm sure it is changing. I don't know if Sandy's got anything.
I was just going to say that might be something we can go to some of the other people in our team who are more on the technical side and see if we could get an answer afterwards in the things that we send out to people. It's definitely something we can ask about.
I'm just reading the chat. I'm just looking at, thanks Bob for inputting on that, it's useful. Looking at communal heat pumps for blocks of flats, that's not something that we've been looking at again.
Oh, yeah, I will share some resources on that in the next section actually, because some other groups have done things like that. So yeah, I can share some information.
Bus available for cooling capable systems. From what I've read of the eligibility, there's nothing specifically referring to cooling capable systems. So I don't see why they wouldn't be included, but also it's probably something to talk through with installers or ask. Yeah, I don't know. Any others, or shall we move on? As you can send in questions after this as well. Yeah.
Great. I think before we go on to this next section, we're just going to have a break for 5-10 minutes. Cool. We'll get started. So yeah, so I think I just wanted to start by sort of summarizing, I guess, a bit of what Marlo was talking about in the first half of the session about the sort of role for community energy groups when it comes to adopting heat pumps. And I guess the thing is that sort of fundamentally, heat pumps are really a lot more of a significant change than better understood areas of retrofit, such as insulation improvements, and even compared to things like air tightness. There's also a lot of skepticism and pushback, and this isn't just from the gas industry, but it's also from traditional sort of HVAC installers, politicians, and sometimes the media. On the other hand, community energy groups are really well placed to support people with adopting heat pumps because they're already a trusted source of impartial advice. And as we can see in the chat, some of you are, receiving inquiries and even starting to offer some support on this area as well. The thing is, a lot of the sort of skepticism around heat pumps isn't unfounded. And in social housing in particular, in the 2010s, there was a lot of heat pumps kind of ripped out due to badly installed and specified schemes. But we know that heat pumps have the potential to exacerbate rather than relieve fuel poverty. And then effective use in performance relies on a combination of in-depth design within the context of an individual home and good installation and the understanding by the user of the efficient way to use the heat pump. So there's a number of kind of key recommendations that can help householders to navigate this, and that's what we've covered in the first half of this session. But also when it comes to things like the boiler upgrade scheme, the financing is also quite complex, and community energy groups could also support users with access to finance or other financing schemes that could be national or specific to your local area. Another thing that community energy groups can do is disseminate information, share real world examples, advise on best practice, and signpost to trusted information sources. And in some cases, that might be trusted installers as well. There's different ways you could do myth busting. You could visit a heat pump at a home, at one that's already been installed. That's a really great way of helping people understand the technology and see how it can work really well. You could also visit a training center. There are certain suppliers like Daikin and Panasonic which have training centers around the country, and they're open for visits. So by seeing the technology in people's homes, it kind of helps to normalize it and lessen that fear factor. In some cases, you might go beyond this information and advisory role. So, for example, we know CAFS and Plymouth Energy Community, and I guess we've seen York Energy Community as well, like a few different groups that we know are offering sort of retrofit assessments and more advice. And you might want to be thinking about how heat pumps could be integrated into any existing sort of retrofit advice you have or other services like that. Another thing is you might want to be involved with commissioning heat pumps, and someone asked before about community schemes. Something we're going to send out about in the links after the session is Crew Energy's next generation project. So they looked at both kind of community buildings, so a sort of leisure centre, community centre, and installing heat pumps on that community asset, but also looking at like blocks of flats and kind of communal housing or multiple homes, or doing a scheme. So that's another approach. You know, we've talked a lot about individual householders and supporting individual kind of able to pay market to put in heat pumps, but there's a big role as well for more kind of mass schemes and community buildings as well. So the rest of this workshop, we're going to kind of introduce a model for starting to identify what are the needs of your own members and users to help you kind of start that process of developing your own heat pump advice or support service. And this is kind of, we're going to share firstly kind of what came out of this process for Carbon Co-op and People Powered Retrofit during our own research phase. So what I'm going to show you now is something called an empathy map. So some of you might have seen these before, you might not have. This is what was on the template that I sent out, which I'll pop in the chat again. But essentially, this empathy map summarizes the research that was done by Carbon Co-op during this heat pump project about users' experience of the heat pump installation process. And you can use an empathy map as a way of kind of understanding your own members' or users' needs before developing services. So I'll just kind of summarize this one. This was developed through interviews with people who'd had heat pumps installed, who were members of the Carbon Co-op and kind of wanted to share their experiences. So starting with kind of what they were thinking and feeling about heat pumps, their goals were that they wanted to be warm or save money and importantly, protect the environment. People really found grant funding important. A lot of them said they wouldn't have kind of done the heat pump installation without it was on the previous scheme, the RHI scheme, and that was super important and they wanted to know about it. They also wanted to know more about living with the heat pump and how it works, and they really wanted someone to follow up after installation. Things they were kind of seeing in order to inform their decisions was kind of Google and search engines, just looking up information. They were seeing other people who'd had heat pump installed and that was inspiring them or giving them information. And they were also looking at the Carbon Co-op forum, which is a member forum for other people who had kind of done this thing as well. One thing they were hearing when they were kind of working on thinking about getting a heat pump, they were hearing some plumbers and gas suppliers and installers saying, don't install it, it won't work in this house. A lot of skepticism. They were also hearing, once they'd had it installed, to just leave it alone and not a lot of information about what they needed to do. And they were also hearing, in terms of finding the right installer, kind of recommendations from people that they know or from service engineers that they trusted. And then in terms of what people were saying about heat pumps, once they've had them installed, they were saying that it's really important to insulate the house and draft proof first, so that fabric first approach, that you need to get heat pump professionals in earlier than you think. I think especially when it comes to the funding schemes, making sure that things are finished in time so that you can apply for the funding, but also that the design can also take a bit of time. And that the heat pump service costs were higher than people were expecting. So Marlo mentioned those earlier, that kind of annual service charge needs to be kind of factored in when thinking about the heat pumps. So this is just kind of a way of summarizing the research that we did and the interviews that we did, but it can be quite a good way of painting a picture of sort of what the needs are of your members or your users before you go off and develop kind of what support you want to provide.